Some people break the rules out of ignorance, others because they never cared. But the hardest ones to reach are the ones who already know the truth and still keep running in the opposite direction. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who refuses to listen. You plead, you warn, you forgive, and they do it again and again and again. If you've ever loved a sinner who won't change, or if that sinner is you, Moses has something to show you. He wasn't just the man who parted the sea. He was the man who watched a nation collapse under the weight of its own stubborn heart, and still stood in the gap, begging God not to give up. But here's what most people forget. Moses himself knew what it meant to be a stubborn sinner. Before he led others, he had to be broken himself. Exodus 2 says Moses killed a man in a burst of rage. He buried the body in the sand and fled for his life. He thought his calling had died in the dust of his mistake, but God brought him back. Not because Moses got it right, but because God saw something deeper, a man who failed and still turned back. That's the first thing Moses teaches us. God's mercy isn't just for the innocent, it's for the guilty who finally stop running. And yet, once Moses began leading the people, he discovered something even harder. It wasn't just him. Everyone was stubborn. They had seen miracles in Egypt. They had walked through a sea that opened up. They had tasted water from a rock, bread from the sky, and still they complained, doubted, rebelled. How do you lead people who already saw God's hand and still prefer their idols? God calls them a stiff-necked people in Exodus 32:9. That word, stiff-necked, means unyielding, like an ox that won't turn even when pulled. It's not just sin, it's defiance. And when Moses came down from Mount Sinai and saw the golden calf, the dancing, the wild rebellion, he shattered the stone tablets in a burst of grief. But watch this, he didn't walk away. He didn't say, they don't deserve saving. He climbed back up the mountain. And in Exodus 32:32, he says something that will break your heart. If you will forgive their sin, forgive it. But if not, blot me out of the book you have written. Who says that? Who offers to be erased so someone else can be redeemed? Moses knew these people were guilty. He didn't excuse their sin, but he was willing to stand in the breach between their failure and God's wrath. Does that sound familiar? Because centuries later, another man would do the same, not just offer to be blotted out, but to be crushed for the sins of others. Isaiah 53:5 says, "He was pierced for our transgressions, and by his wounds we are healed." Moses gives us a shadow of Jesus, but also a lesson for us. What do you do when the people around you keep failing? When you feel alone in your obedience? When your patience is worn thin? You climb back up the mountain. You intercede. You pray for hearts to soften, even when they don't seem to change. And you trust that God isn't done, even when you are. But here's something few people say out loud. It's not just them who are stiff-necked. We are too. How many times have you promised to stop and didn't? How many times have you seen God's mercy and still complained about his silence? This is what Moses understood. God isn't looking for perfect people. He's looking for those who keep coming back. In Exodus 34, Moses meets God again. This time, God doesn't just give new tablets. He gives something even deeper, a revelation of his name. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. It's one of the most repeated descriptions of God in the Bible. And it was given right after the people committed their worst sin, not before, not after they proved they were good, but in the middle of their rebellion, because that's who God is, and that's what Moses learned. God is not afraid of our failure, but he will confront it, not to crush us, but to bring us back. This is what makes grace so hard to believe. We think it's given when we clean up our mess, but God shows it in the middle of our mess. So what does that mean for you? It means you don't have to wait to be better to come closer. It means when your heart is still tangled in rebellion, when your thoughts are still pulled in the wrong direction, when your mouth still says things you regret, that's the moment God invites you near, not because your sin is small, but because His mercy is greater. Let that sink in. Moses knew the weight of standing between failure and hope. He felt the tension of watching people hurt themselves and still praying for them. And maybe that's where you are now. Maybe you're tired of trying to help people who won't change. Maybe you've grown cold from waiting too long. Maybe the one who refuses to change is you. Either way, hear this. The heart of God is not hardened toward the stubborn, but He will not ignore sin either. He will confront you, not with condemnation, but with invitation to come back, to trust again, to stop hiding behind excuses and start leaning into mercy. Not everyone around Moses responded. Some died in their rebellion. Some hardened their hearts further, but others changed. Others saw the fire in Moses' eyes, the tears in his prayers, the truth in his words, and they followed. You don't need to change everyone. You just need to stay faithful. Stay on your knees. Speak truth with love, and never forget, the same God who met Moses on the mountain meets you in the quiet places of your battle. He sees every stubborn corner of your heart, and He still draws near. Moses wasn't just a prophet. He was a shepherd of broken people, a man who knew the pain of watching the ones you love walk away from the truth, again and again. He understood what it meant to feel betrayed, not just by enemies, but by your own people. Numbers 14 shows one of the darkest moments of his leadership. The people stood at the edge of the promised land and refused to enter. After all the miracles, after all the grace, they still said, "Let's go back to Egypt." Back to slavery, back to chains. Can you imagine the heartbreak? Moses had spent years walking with them through deserts, praying for them, protecting them, and in one sentence, they rejected everything. Have you ever poured your soul into someone only to watch them turn their back? That's what makes Moses' response so shocking. He doesn't yell, he doesn't shame them. He falls on his face before God and asks for mercy. Numbers 14:19. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now. Do you hear the depth of that? Just as you have pardoned them, again and again. Keep forgiving. Moses wasn't enabling their sin, he was appealing to the heart of God. He knew what it meant to grieve sin without giving up on the sinner. That's something many of us haven't learned. We either go silent and bitter or loud and judgmental, but Moses stayed soft and firm at the same time, and God responded. He said, "I have forgiven them as you asked." Numbers 14:20. But not without consequence. The generation that refused to enter the land would not receive it. They would wander 40 more years in the wilderness, not because God hated them, but because they refused to trust Him. Here's the hard truth Moses understood. Forgiveness doesn't always remove the consequence, but it always reveals the heart of God. And that heart is still open, even when the door we wanted is closed, even when the wilderness feels like punishment. It's also protection, because sometimes what we think is the land of promise is not the place we're ready to handle. Moses learned to trust that God's no could still carry His love. And that changed how he saw the people. They weren't just rebels. They were children, learning slowly, painfully, to follow. Is that how you see your own story? Because some of us walk through seasons where we feel like failures, not because God has abandoned us, but because we've been circling the same wilderness for too long. You keep saying, "I should be farther by now." But maybe what's happening isn't delay, it's preparation. That's what Moses discovered. God wasn't just taking them to the land, He was forming their hearts along the way, and the wilderness was necessary to reveal what they carried inside. So, if you feel stuck right now, spiritually dry, emotionally exhausted, frustrated by your lack of progress, don't forget, even that space can be sacred. It's where Moses saw water come from rocks, where the cloud and fire led the way, where the tabernacle was built, where the voice of God came day after day. Some of God's deepest work happens in the places you didn't ask to stay. But you're not forgotten, and you're not being punished. You're being formed. But Moses learned something else too, that even leaders can miss out. In Numbers 20, the people complained again. No water, no hope, the same old story. God told Moses to speak to the rock. But Moses, tired and angry, struck it instead, and water flowed. The people rejoiced. But God said something Moses would never forget. Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land I give them. Numbers 20-12. That one moment cost him the dream. And here's where the story shifts. Because Moses had spent his life interceding for the people, now no one was interceding for him. No one begged God to let him in. No one climbed the mountain on his behalf. And Moses had to sit with that. Sometimes you give everything for others and still don't receive what you hoped for. But here's the grace in that moment. God didn't abandon Moses. In Deuteronomy 34, God takes him to the top of Mount Nebo and shows him the land. All the land. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. It sounds like a tragedy, but it's actually one of the most intimate scenes in the Bible. God knew Moses wouldn't enter, but he gave him a glimpse, and he himself buried Moses, Deuteronomy 34:5-6. No one else, no grave marked, just God and his servant, because the story of Moses was never about success or accomplishment. It was about faithfulness. He walked with God, even when others wouldn't. He stood in the gap, even when he was tired, and when the moment came, he let go of the dream with trust. That's what Moses understood about stubborn sinners like us, that God's mercy is more persistent than our resistance, that grace can carry a nation farther than strength, that even in failure, God still walks with you to the edge and lets you see his promise. So, if you feel like your sin disqualifies you, or like your obedience hasn't paid off, or that you've carried others and now no one carries you, you're not alone. Moses knew exactly how that felt, but he also knew this. The journey with God is never wasted. Even if you don't get what you hoped for, you get him. And in the end, that's more than enough. You may never split a sea or see fire on a mountain, but you know what it means to carry disappointment, to wrestle with people who won't change, to wonder if your obedience was worth it. That's what makes Moses such a powerful mirror. He didn't walk with God because it was easy. He walked with God because there was nowhere else to go. He didn't serve because people applauded. He served because God called. He wasn't perfect, but he was faithful. And faithfulness leaves a mark deeper than success ever could. Think about this. The man who struck the rock, who killed a man, who doubted himself at every turn, stood with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, Matthew 17:3. He made it to the promised land, not by law, but by grace. That's the gospel in a single image. You may not get everything you want in this life. You may stumble. You may miss some doors you once prayed for. But if you stay with God, even when you don't understand him, you will stand with him in the end. That's the kind of life Moses lived, and it's the kind of life still available to you. But here's the question. Are you willing to be that honest? Are you willing to admit you've been stubborn? Are you willing to admit that some of the wilderness in your life wasn't punishment but pride? That some of the delay wasn't from others, it was from your own resistance? God isn't afraid of those confessions. He already knows, and He's not looking for perfection. He's looking for surrender. So what does surrender look like when you're tired? It looks like this. Keep praying for the people who keep breaking your heart. Keep climbing back up the mountain, even when the first answer was no. Keep laying your plans down when God calls you to let go. And trust that nothing you do for Him is ever wasted, even when no one sees, even when it feels like you're buried in the wilderness. That's what Moses would tell you. You don't need applause to be faithful. You need a heart that stays soft and a will that stays steady. But don't miss this part. Moses didn't walk alone. He had Aaron, he had Joshua, he had Miriam. He had moments when his arms were held up by others, like in Exodus 17, when the battle turned not by strength, but by support. So maybe this is the time to stop carrying everything by yourself. Reach out. Let someone pray with you. Let someone remind you of the promises when your eyes can't see them anymore. We weren't made to walk through deserts alone, and sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is admit you're exhausted. The people Moses led were broken, but the leader God chose was broken too, and somehow that's what made it work. Because when broken people depend on a perfect God, miracles still happen. So let me ask you, what part of your heart is still stiff-necked? Where are you resisting, pretending, or hiding? Is there a sin you've learned to manage instead of surrender? A wound you've tried to cover instead of heal? A person you've given up on or become? If Moses were here, I think he'd say this: don't stop praying. Don't stop standing in the gap. Don't stop hoping for people who don't seem to change. And don't stop coming back, even when you've failed. Because grace didn't stop at the golden calf. Mercy didn't end at the edge of the land. Love didn't break when the tablets shattered. God kept writing His story, even in the hands of a man who doubted himself, and a people who kept forgetting Him. That's the God who calls you too. And if you're wondering what to do next, start with this. Open the Bible to Exodus 34. Read the words God said to Moses. Write them down. Repeat them out loud. Let them soak in. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Then ask yourself, do I believe this? Really believe? Because everything changes when you do. You don't have to perform anymore. You don't have to fake strength. You don't have to pretend you're not struggling. You just need to return. The same way Moses did, again and again. The same way Israel did, even after wandering. The same way Jesus invites us to every single day. This is not just a story about Moses. It's a story about you, about your stubborn places, about your unspoken regrets, about your desert seasons, and about the God who walks with you through all of them, and still says, I'm not done with you yet. So here's what I want you to remember. If you've fallen, get up. If you've been hard-hearted, let Him soften you. If you've been holding on to guilt, surrender it. And if you've been carrying the weight of others, don't stop standing in the gap, because someone's salvation might be waiting on the prayers you almost gave up praying. And one day, when you least expect it, God might take you to the top of your own mountain, not to punish you, but to show you the promise, to remind you that He saw everything you carried, and that none of it was wasted. You are not forgotten. You are not too far gone. You are not alone. So keep walking. Even if it's in the desert, keep listening. Even when the silence lingers, keep trusting. Even if the outcome doesn't look the way you planned. Because faith isn't measured by what you accomplish. It's measured by who you stay close to. And if you stay close to Him, He will take you farther than you ever imagined. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of Moses' story spoke to your heart today? Where do you see yourself? In the wilderness, at the rock, or climbing the mountain again? Leave your answer in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's pray for one another. And if you want to keep discovering what God is doing in the middle of your hardest questions, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon. We're not afraid of your questions, and neither is God. See you in the next video.